interesting how we fit into this as well. I learned that we're not really doing anything with big data this morning, but we hope that someday our work will, maybe it's a pipe dream, but I think we hope that it will branch out into big data applications. And so we're at the baby stages of this. But yeah, my name's Andy Kittleson. I'm actually still a postdoctoral fellow, but I will be starting a faculty position in the physical therapy program in the fall. I don't have any financial disclosures, but I do have one disclosure, which is that I learned recently that I look exactly like Flanders from The Simpsons. So actually it's more of a therapeutic admission than an actual disclosure. And I think, broadly speaking, our interest in this area is to have research and clinical practice sort of better inform each other. This isn't a picture from my wedding, but I have a very similar one where, and being involved in the evidence-based practice curriculum in the physical therapy program, I think this is often how we feel like the process works, where poor clinicians are just trying to survive the onslaught of research information that's coming at them. And we on the research side sort of often feel like, well, we're producing all this great information and it's your job, practitioners, to figure out how to take this in and use it. And I think our goal is to have it be more like this, where we're actually giving clinical practice information that's helpful, and they are also, patients and clinicians are also providing us with feedback that we can use to generate things that are relevant to them. And so hopefully what I talk about will sort of illustrate how we think, or one way that we think we might be able to go about this. So as Jen mentioned, in total knee replacement, everyone can agree that outcomes collection is important, but we've done a bad job up till this point of collecting the outcomes that are probably the most relevant for this population. So it's only relatively recently that we've come to appreciate that in folks following total knee replacement, there's a lot of functional deficits that aren't captured by our standardized questionnaire-based outcome instruments. So the question is, how do we actually collect the outcomes that are really relevant for tracking patients, informing decision-making, things like that? So what I'll talk about is sort of one approach that we've taken, or our experience in sort of trying to implement outcomes data collection where the data can then be used in our analyses moving forward. And so we were approached by a group of clinicians at ATI Physical Therapy. I haven't cited them here or acknowledged them, and I should have, but what they said is we're collecting these outcomes, on people following total knee replacement surgery, and we don't really know how to use the information. We don't really know if we're doing it in the right way or not. And so they approached us and said, how can you help us with this? And so just broadly speaking, our method has been to try to achieve systematic outcomes data collection by, number one, making it easy, and then number two, making it useful. So what they were finding was really they weren't getting good information from their efforts because there was a lot of missingness, a lot of variation in how people were actually collecting the outcomes measures, etc. And so in working with them, we came up with a protocol that attempted to make outcomes collection feasible. In other words, the instruments were easy to perform, and they were able to perform it in a routine clinical setting, not time-consuming. And then we separated in space and time the data management side of things from the outcomes collection side of things. And then step two was, we sort of thought, well, people will do a better job of this if it's actually useful to their practice. So let's not have them collect outcomes that aren't relevant. Let's keep the outcomes relevant to their clinical decisions. And then let's try to make our research aims integrate with what they're doing. So I'll try to touch on exactly what I mean by those steps. first of all, we developed a battery of clinical outcomes that takes less than 5 minutes, and we worked to integrate this as seamlessly as possible with their practice patterns and clinical flow. So when we started with doing this, we thought, oh, it'll be great if we create sort of a spreadsheet-based type format that can play well with our REDCap databases and things like that. And what we quickly learned was for clinicians in a busy setting to try to toggle between multiple windows on their laptop and things like that, it just killed the feasibility of it. So we actually settled on a paper-based system. And Jen also talked about how we ran into problems with changing EMRs over time. And so this is what we came up with. And we actually designed it so that it flows well with their patient interaction. So when a patient comes in, they have a conversation with them, ask them some questions about how they're functioning, and then they move into some functional tests that look at mobility from a seated position into a standing position, walking around in the clinic, measuring their walking speed, returning to a seated position so we can measure lower extremity strength, which is a key outcome in this population, and then finally ending up in the supine position to measure flexibility of the knee and then continue with their physical exam from there. So just from the standpoint of even trying to make our outcomes collection match sort of what's easy to do in their busy setting. And then it's very important, obviously, that our measures are feasible. And so we know, not surprisingly, that lower extremity strength is one of the major things that's affected by a total knee replacement. And so we think it's important to measure this. But the gold standard instrument is a isokinetic dynamometer that costs probably between $50,000 and $75,000. It's very time consuming to operate that. It requires a fair amount of training. And so we implemented handheld dynamometry, where we just have the person kick into this little device that measures force. And when you do this, there's a lot of ways you can contribute extra variability to this test if you're not doing it consistently across patients. So we instituted sort of a training program across, so the therapists undergo this sort of quarterly training where they are taught the proper way to do this in a way that's reproducible and we think reliable over time. And then what's key here is I think a lot of people sort of hope that if they just unleash this sort of data collection protocol, that then you can sort of rely on things like maybe systems in your EMR or processes within the clinic to ensure that you're getting high quality data. And our experience has been that it's better if you just make the clinic's job treating patients, and then when it comes to the quality of the data, we do a lot of the data checking on our end, and so we have a lot of people that are involved with actually entering the clinical data from the EMR into our REDCap database, and these are people who know about the population, so people who can detect numbers that don't make sense and things like that as they're sort of mirroring what's in the EMR. So it's a very labor-intensive process, but I think something that, in our experience, is ideal or maybe even required to getting the data quality that we want. And then another note here: has anybody heard of the photo database? I wouldn't expect that you necessarily would, but this is a commercial product that's available in the physical therapy world, where you can subscribe as a clinic. You can subscribe to this tool that allows you to track outcomes over time in your clinic. And not to cast dispersions on photo, but one of the key features they have is that they'll tell you how well you're doing as a clinic in relation to other clinics. They'll tell you how well you're doing as a therapist in relation to other therapists. And there's no way of systematically enforcing data collection on all patients. So in practice, what can often happen is when you know as a therapist that you have a problematic patient, that person sort of magically doesn't get entered into your photo database because you don't want that negative outcome to be reflected in your, or potential negative outcome to be reflected in your clinic metrics. And so what we've been very careful about, and there was a good discussion earlier about, trying to use data to detect good or bad performance of certain clinicians. And our strategy up until now has been not to do that at all, but basically to say, we want to get as complete a data set as possible. We want the data to be as reliable as possible. And so we don't use it in terms of judging performance at all at this point. And in fact, we provide the only sort of quality feedback that we provide that's at a therapist level is on the completeness of the data that they're collecting. So that's just been our strategy up until now. So we think it's really important if people are going to be collecting these data in their routine practice that it's actually useful to them. And so Jen mentioned earlier that a lot of the outcomes that we collect in standardized fashion may not actually be the best things for reflecting the trajectory of recovery of any individual patient. And so we worked with our clinical collaborators to choose the outcomes that are going to be responsive in that population, that are going to be sensitive to change over time. So as an example, when they came to us, they wanted to assess balance in all of their patients. And they were doing this single limb stance test where the patient just stands on one leg, and if they can do it for a full minute, then they pass the test. Otherwise, you record the time at which they lose their balance. Well, that takes a whole minute to conduct that one test, and it turns out most patients will max this out very early after surgery. So it's not a very useful outcome for them. Whereas the timed up and go test, which involves a patient rising from a chair, walking a distance of 3 meters, returning back to the chair and sitting down, also measures aspects of balance and is highly sensitive to change right away after surgery. So we sort of advise them in that regard on that. So hopefully they'll be more likely to document outcomes because it'll actually be informative of how their patients are doing. And then finally, what I'll talk about is how we actually hope to develop products from our research that can be integrated with practice that can make this outcomes collection further informative. So as an example of what we hope to do, I need to say, this is probably not unique to physical therapy, but historically what we've done in physical therapy is we've used these outcome measures simply to document patient outcomes. So when a patient comes in for therapy, we make a measurement, then we do whatever it is that we do, and then we, at the end, document how they did. So it's not really used to monitor progress over time or to inform us of patient progress to inform our decision making. And what we'd like to do is to actually see outcomes measures used to monitor progress, detect deviations from what's an expected clinical course so that we can actually make adjustments in how we're doing this. So let me just explain a little bit about what we envision from that standpoint. So the timed up and go test, which I explained, is a brief test of mobility. Faster times are better on this test. And here's I'm not going to call it big data, it's 240 people, but these are our data that show timed up and go times following surgery for about the first 4 months after surgery. So you can see there's variability in how people do on this. When I show this slide to clinicians, people start nodding their heads because they're like, yeah, there's a lot of variability here. How do we interpret what's good or bad for any individual patient? And that's actually one of the central questions with a lot of things in physical therapy is how do you anchor your understanding of what's good and bad? It probably depends on the individual patient. One way we think you could do it is by building a reference chart such that now when a patient comes in after surgery and you make this measurement, you're not just saying, and so by the way, this is something that we don't know if we don't collect the data. So in most clinical settings, this is a complete black box. It's unknown what the degree of variability is in this. Whereas if we actually collect the data, we could build these reference charts. And we could say, well, when somebody comes in after surgery and I measure them at about a month after surgery and they're at 10 seconds on the timed up and go, well, that tells me that they're pretty much doing as expected relative to other people who have undergone the surgery. So the idea would be that now you're making these measurements not just to document what's happening, but to inform your understanding of how the person is doing in real time. But as I mentioned, people see this and they go, well, we know that not everybody does the same after surgery, and we know that certain patients are probably not going to do as well as others if they're older, if they have multiple comorbidities and things like that. Other people, younger, active individuals, are likely to do better. So we really need to anchor our understanding not around the whole population of people undergoing total knee replacement, but around similar patients. And this is where some of our big data methods, even if they're not being used on big data sets, might come in handy, we think. So what if, for example, we had a new person considering surgery, and this is just hypothetical data, but for example, a 60-year-old male with a relatively healthy BMI and a preoperative timed up and go time of 6.7 seconds. We can use some methodologies, which I could talk about if there are questions on this, what we've chosen to approach this, but we could use our analytical sort of methodologies to identify similar patients, and then we could use their actual recovery data to then provide estimates of what's expected for this new person. So now, during therapy, we know, hopefully, with more precision, what's normal and what's not normal. And we can start setting goals more appropriately, and we can start monitoring with more precision how an individual is doing. And when somebody starts doing bad, we can say, oh, we can detect that, and we can make a change in our strategy. So on the other hand, we had an older male with higher BMI and a very slow preoperative timed up and go time. We can identify their closest matches, and then we can develop an understanding of what's expected for them, and we can anchor our understanding of what's a good and bad outcome in the context of similar patients. So this is our goal moving forward, is to get better with some of these matching strategies. With this person, it might be unreasonable to set goals of, a timed up and go time of 10 seconds at 1 month after surgery, right? So that's sort of where we envision going with some of this stuff. So in summary, we envision a paradigm shift, if you will, from outcomes collection for the sake of just collecting the outcomes to more of outcomes collection in order to monitor progress of individual patients. We think this could help with goal setting in these patient populations where not everybody can always agree on what is a good or bad outcome at any point in time. We think it will also help with documentation in a clinical setting in terms of having an evidence base to justify some decisions. And ultimately, we think this may be helpful in terms of guiding patient and clinician decisions in terms of what's the best course of action for this individual patient given their circumstances. That's our goal. I will plug, we're working with Professor Stefan Buren in the Netherlands, who, I don't know if anybody out there uses the MICE package for multiple imputation. He's the MICE guy, he invented it. So he's our collaborator who's working with us on some of these methods, and he'll be visiting in November, and he's giving a seminar in the biostats department on their Wednesday seminars on November 2nd. And so he's been really helpful in terms of guiding our thought process how to do these analyses and matching strategies. And so if you're available to attend this seminar, I'd love to see you there. And yeah, I'll take any, I guess we can wait until the end for questions.